Let's look at Exhibit A for stupid shit the U.S. has done. We spent $8 trillion in the Middle East, okay, on wars. That's all debt that we've got. And we killed some innocent people. We've got veterans walking around the United States, missing a limb from an IED. We've got huge, the veterans' costs are like $380 billion a year to take care of those guys, and they should be taken care of. I mean, nobody disputes that. But why? So that, Iraq could have oil that they now sell to the Chinese, or so that, we could dominate Afghanistan and then turn around and give it back? What the hell were we thinking? Now, Dick Cheney's rich and Halliburton succeeded, but the rest of us pay the price. I think what's going on is we're in a sovereign debt crisis, and the rest of the world is realizing that the U.S. is technically bankrupt.
Yeah.
So nobody wants our bonds.
I think the Fed's buying them, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're printing money and buying the Fed's buying them.
I think that's
But that's what they're doing in Western Europe as well.
Yeah, effectively. And they have to do that. And by the way, that's only going to get worse.
Let me put a theoretical scenario in front of you. Let's just say Musk is so successful with what he's done with USAID, and it's so popular, and he's got his 4 computer whiz kids or whatever it is who he takes into all these government bodies with him, and they run computer programming and they find out. Just say he goes
big balls, Dominic.
Big bollocks, as we call it. But let's just say those guys go into Social Security, healthcare, the military-industrial complex, and they do something similar. Will you still be in an unpayable debt situation?
The way I see it right now, they can slow it down. They can't stop it. My opinion, looking at the math, is it's too far gone. The right way to deal with this debt situation is to try and grow our way out of it through productivity increases. And they're going to try that for sure. And a lot of the Trump deregulation policies, they're going to help.
And the big issue is that America is the most important country in the world economically, certainly in the Western world. I look at things from the UK, little old UK, remember us? If you think you're bad, we are way worse.
Really?
And Western Europe is way worse.
Wow.
We're more corrupt, our civil service is bigger, our levels of corruption, of taxation, corruption, same thing, are higher. There is so much stifling bureaucracy. We have less opportunity to grow our way out of it. Our energy costs are way, way higher. At least you produce your own energy. We don't even do that. We import it from you for environmental reasons, even though we've got the gas ourselves. I mean, what's coming in Western Europe is way worse.
And this is a worldwide problem. I mean, it's not as if China is free of all these as well.
And Japan.
They've got a ton of debt as well. What's happened here, really, big picture, we followed the wrong model. We followed the Keynesian model of use debt, print money, try and grow the top line nominally, not worrying about inflation. And it's like chasing your tail. You just can't do it. What we need to do is go back to a sound money standard and become more efficient and drive productivity. And so on a sound money standard, you get a much more productive economy, and you don't have this lopsided, series of malinvestments.
So how do you get to a hard money situation? How do you restore sound money without some kind of dramatic upwards revaluation of gold and Bitcoin?
One way we get there is we have hyperinflation. The system just fails and collapses. And a lot of
That'd be terrible.
It'd be terrible, and a lot of people think that's extreme, and that could never happen in the United States with a reserve currency, but I'm here to say it could happen. The sane way to fix things, in my view, is to do some kind of a monetary reset, where, as you described, we devalue the dollar versus gold and Bitcoin. As with so many things in government, nothing really happens until there's a crisis. You have to go there, and it's only your last choice. But Scott Bessent's the new Treasury Secretary. Trump picked him. He's a hedge fund manager. His largest holding before he took the position was gold.
Really?
He is a gold bug guy, and he likes.
So he's incentivized.
Bessent understands gold, and Bessent understands the debt crisis that we're in. He gets it. He can see it. He understands what's going on. He's dropped these little hints, and they're kind of cryptic, but he has definitely said things like, in June, he said, there's some monetary issues here, and there might be some kind of a need for a restructuring of the world monetary system, a la Bretton Woods, the 1944 restructuring. And if that happens, I want to be at the table. That's interesting. I mean, this is brain surgery. It's going to be hard, and people are going to get hurt. I mean, bondholders, there's no way that bondholders don't lose over the next 10 years. I just can't see how anybody holding any sovereign debt of length and duration is going to come out whole in terms of purchasing power. Can't see it. But if we do a one-time reset where we have a very high inflationary period, but then we go back to sound money, I could see a situation where, things are pretty good. And, Trump cuts deregulation, we cut government expenses, we balance the budget. I mean, there is a path through this. There's an optimistic path through this, but it's not trivial. It's going to be work.
Okay, I'm going to have a discussion with you now, Larry.
Welcome back to another episode of CypherPunk'd, where we explore money's history, crypto's future, and Web3's role in advancing human rights, freedom, and digital liberty. Today's guests are two powerhouse voices in the world of sound money and financial sovereignty. Larry Lepard, a veteran investor and gold advocate who's now a full-throttle Bitcoiner, and Dominic Frisby, also known as the Walmart Jordan Peterson, with a better voice, author of Daylight Robbery, stand-up comedian, and sharpwood commentator on the intersection of money, taxation, and individual freedom. Larry Lepard is a managing partner at Equity Management Associates and author of the newly released book, The Big Print, What Happened to America and How Sound Money Will Fix It. Larry's been a vocal advocate for sound money principles since 2008, managing over $60 million in gold, silver, and Bitcoin investments. As a Harvard Business School graduate and a seasoned investment manager, he brings unique insights into the intersection of traditional finance and the future of money. Welcome, guys. Let's dive right in.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matty. And it's an honor to be with Dominic. He did something really epic. He shined a Bitcoin beacon on the Bank of England and took a photo of it. And I'll never forget that. I think it's so friggin' cool.
That was fantastic.
We projected the words "Bitcoin fixes this" onto the Bank of England
Right.
during the lockdown.
I saw that. I was like, I got to meet this guy.
Going right at the longest standing fiat currency.
We did, and we
Right
did
to the
money printer go brrr as well. We did.
Did
that.
you? Yeah, I didn't see that.
My favorite was the BBC one,
British Brainwashing Corporation.
There you go.
funded by U.S. taxpayers. USAID, baby.
USAID, yeah.
Larry, you've been managing sound money investments since 2008. What was your aha moment that made you realize our monetary system needed fixing?
Well, I kind of generally knew it was broken before 2008, but 2008 was just an amazing wake-up call for me. I mean, I was just like, oh my dear God, what are they doing? I mean, when they went to ZIRP, 0% interest rates, and by the way, that's just a tautology. I mean, capital is supposed to have value, and so it pays an interest rate. And if there's no interest rate, that implies the capital is worthless, which is actually true with fiat money. It is worthless. And so when they went to 0% interest rates, and then they started printing money, and not just a little money, a lot of money in the trillions, I was like, oh my God. I mean, the Fed balance sheet pre that event was 890 million or something, billion or so, and they printed that very quickly. And then of course that was QE1, and they went 2, 3, and so forth. So when that happened, I was just like, wow, this is just a different landscape. We're going to have monetary chaos. And I kind of changed my whole life. I kind of pivoted. I was managing funds that were focused on growth at a reasonable price, often in technology. I've been a big investor in the internet and other technology companies. And I saw that and I thought, oh, I get this. I know what's going to happen. We're going to have inflation. There's going to be monetary debasement. So I pivoted into gold and gold mining stocks and silver mining stocks. And I was kind of aware of Bitcoin, but I really didn't pick up on it until 2013 or so.
I'm going to let everybody know that we have both of your books, two of both of your books here, just on display, and I'm excited to. Right now, we're recording our series on Daylight Robbery, which is one of my favorite books, and I'm in the process of reading your book, Larry. So
Thanks.
So hopefully, looking forward to doing our series on the show as well, going down all the rabbit holes.
I'm looking forward to that too. Yeah.
So let me ask both of you a question, if I may. So we're in this incredible first 100 days where Trump and Elon Musk are exposing, lifting up the rocks and just finding all these terrible ways by which America has been spending its money. And you know that Western Europe's been doing the same thing, only worse. It's just there's nobody lifting up the rocks. But in view of the fact that I think Musk's philosophy is pretty libertarian, and he's a small government, low tax guy. What's going to happen to the money printers now?
Well, yeah. So, look, as my book lays out, and as I think you would probably agree with me, Dominic, they have to keep printing because of the math. And so, and the book is entitled The Big Print. We've had two big prints. We had one in 2020. We had one in 2008. There's another one coming because, as Lynn points out, nothing stops the train, and you can't continue to grow the debt without growing the underlying money supply. But let's talk about Musk and Doge. I really applaud what he's doing. I mean, this is fantastic that he's lifting up the rocks, as you point out. And I hope he succeeds. But like so many entrepreneurs, he tends to kind of have a big goal that may not be achievable. He said he could cut $2 trillion off the federal budget, and I don't see how they can do that. With all due respect,
what do you like? I guess what the rationale for that, in my mind, of what I heard was that right before COVID, that was the budget. It was like $2.5 trillion less.
Correct.
So to go back just like 3 years and just spend what we did then, that seems so simple. Is that not? You don't think that's possible?
It does, but he's had a couple things go against him. Back before COVID, interest rates were lower, and now the federal government interest expense alone is running at 1.3 to 1.4. So unless they cut rates, which will then fuel another credit cycle and more inflation, he's dealing with that. And the spending is kind of like a ratchet, and once it goes up, it's very hard to bring it back.
We actually just talked about that today.
Yeah, we talked the ratchet effect. When there's a crisis, the spending goes up during the crisis, and once the crisis has passed, it never goes back to the level it was before the crisis began.
Exactly.
It sort of stabilizes at a higher point.
And when you look at the math, they spent $6.75 trillion in fiscal, just ended September 30 of 24. And, basically, if you take Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, interest, that's 80% in those buckets. And, Social Security and Medicare are kind of the third rail. I mean, you're going to have a very hard time cutting those with all the voters that won't allow that to happen. Maybe they get the defense budget down. I mean, maybe they, create peace in the Ukraine, and that helps a little bit. We stop sending billions of dollars there. But, and the interest expense, that's really the big elephant in the room. The fact that the debt is going towards 37 trillion, and it's not cheap debt anymore. I mean, we hit all that. When interest rates were low, had a lot of debt, your interest expense isn't so bad.
I remember Trump was talking about this during his previous administration. He wanted to refinance out like 100 years or something at like these super low rates, and everybody was talking shit about it. But I was like, that would have fucking been genius.
It would have been. Well, Yellen, when rates were low, Yellen should have put as much of it out into long-term debt as she could. However, I mean, and Luke Groman points this out. I mean, the odds are she really couldn't do it. I don't think the demand was there. I mean, foreign buyers have not been net buyers of Treasury since 2014. In fact, they've been net sellers. And so, I think what's going on is we're in a sovereign debt crisis, and the rest of the world is realizing that the U.S. is technically bankrupt. Yeah. So nobody wants our bonds. And that's a problem.
I think the Fed's buying them, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're printing money and buying, the Fed's buying them.
I think that's
but that's what they're doing in Western Europe as well.
Yeah, effectively. And they have to do that. And by the way, that's only going to get worse. And what they're,
Well, so let me put a theoretical scenario. Well, it is.
It is.
Let me put a theoretical scenario in front of you. Let's just say Musk is so successful with what he's done with USAID, and it's so popular. And let's just say and he's got his 4 computer whiz kids or whatever it is, who he takes into all these government bodies with him, and they run computer programming and they find out. So let's just say he goes.
Big balls, Dominic.
Those guys.
Big balls.
Big bollocks, as we call it. But let's just say those guys go into Social Security, healthcare, the military-industrial complex, and they do something similar, and they find loads of fraudulent spending. And it's bound to be there in the military-industrial.
Just to interject here, I think that's actually what they're already saying. So I think
so let's just
say the narrative that's been out in the public is that it's impossible to do this.
Okay, so let's just say that they do that, and even though your military is like, you worship your military like we worship the NHS. But let's just say they do that, and they find loads of fraudulent payments, and they turn it into a much more efficient machine where the money spent does actually go to people that taxpayers would want it to go to. And so they clean it up. Let's just say that happens. How much will you still be in an unpayable debt situation?
It's unclear. I mean, it depends on how much that happens. I mean, the way I see it right now, they can slow it down. They can't stop it. But, and related to that, I think the big unknown is, what do they do with interest rates? And what happens to the bond market? I mean, if they keep issuing debt, eventually the bond market is going to say no mas. And when the bond market says no mas, interest rates go higher, and this is the debt doom loop. And so,
I was about to ask you, I didn't want to unpack your whole book because we're going to do a series on it. But this idea of the debt doom loop, can you break down what this means for the average person?
Sure. So let's just uncover that. So, the U.S. federal government runs deficits. The deficits need to be financed. To pay for the deficit, they issue bonds. The bonds go into a fixed size amount of demand for those bonds. You're issuing more, same amount of buyers. The buyers say, I need a higher rate in order to accept that additional debt. That higher rate then is something that the government has to pay, right? And so suddenly, instead of 800 billion of interest or 900 billion of interest, we're now at kind of 1.314 trillion of annual run rate interest. If we issue a lot more debt, that'll be 1.5, 1.6, 1.8, and they keep making the deficit bigger. So now you have a bigger deficit. You got to issue more bonds. And can you see how the reflexivity here is? That's a doom loop. You have to issue more. Issuing more means rate goes higher. Rate goes higher means deficit gets bigger. You have to issue even more. So that's, now can they reverse that? Possibly. I mean, I can't say with certainty they won't. But I think, Dominic, what you're describing, it's going to take a lot of luck. And I think my opinion, looking at the math, is it's too far gone. But that doesn't mean I'm right. I mean, it's possible that, they're trying to do a lot of other things. They're trying to increase productivity. They're trying to get the price of oil down. The right way to deal with this debt situation is to try and grow our way out of it through productivity increases. And they're going to try that for sure. And a lot of the Trump deregulation policies, they're going to help. So, look, this is all net positive for the country, what's going on. But I guess what my book posits, and if you look at the charts and the math in my book, you would think, it's going to be a push. It's going to be hard. You know what I mean? Even if they really succeed, it's going to be hard.
I mean, the big issue is that America is the most important country in the world economically, certainly in the Western world. I look at things from the UK, little old UK, remember us? If you think you're bad, we are way worse.
Really?
And Western Europe is way worse.
Wow.
We're more corrupt, our civil service is bigger, our levels of corruption, of taxation, corruption, same thing, are are higher, and there is so much stifling bureaucracy. We have less opportunity to grow our way out of it. Our energy costs are way, way higher. At least you produce your own energy. We don't even do that. We import it from you for environmental reasons, even though we've got the gas ourselves. I mean, So I'm just listening to you not moaning, but you know what I mean, talking about America.
Sure.
I'm thinking what's coming in Western Europe is way worse.
I would agree with that based on what I've seen. Yeah, obviously I don't live there, so I don't see it firsthand, but I hear about it, and it certainly seems true to me. I mean, and this is a worldwide problem. I mean, it's not as if China is free of all these as well.
Yeah,
I mean,
Japan,
they've got a ton of debt as well. And so, look, what's happened here is, my book outlines this. What's happened here, really, big picture, we followed the wrong model. We followed the Keynesian model of use debt, print money, try and grow the top line nominally, not worrying about inflation. And it's like chasing your tail. You just can't do it. I mean, what we need to do is go back to a sound money standard and become more efficient and drive productivity. And so on a sound money standard, you get a much more productive economy, and you don't have this lopsided, series of malinvestments. And I mean, look, the U.S. has done so many stupid things. I mean, in the UK, you guys came along and participated with us, but let's look at Exhibit A for stupid shit the U.S. has done. We spent $8 trillion in the Middle East, okay, on wars after 2001. That's all debt that we've got. And we killed some innocent people. We've got veterans walking around the United States, missing a limb from an IED. We've got huge, the veterans' costs are like $380 billion a year to take care of those guys, and they should be taken care of. I mean, nobody disputes that. But why? So that, Iraq could have oil that they now sell to the Chinese, or so that, we could dominate Afghanistan and then turn around and give it back.
Took it from the Taliban. Spent 20.
You didn't exactly make yourselves popular either.
Spent $3 trillion.
Well, that's exactly right.
And then give it back to the Taliban.
Yeah. So I mean, if I look at geopolitical government colossal blunders of the past 20 years, that one just has to stick out like an incredible sore thumb. I mean, what the hell were we thinking? Now, Dick Cheney's rich and Halliburton succeeded, but the rest of us pay the price.
So how do you get to a hard money situation? How do you restore sound money without some kind of dramatic upwards revaluation of gold and Bitcoin?
I don't see how you can. And as the book talks about, one way we get there is we have hyperinflation. The system just fails and collapses. And a lot of people,
terrible.
It'd be terrible. And a lot of people think that's extreme and that could never happen in the United States with a reserve currency. But I'm here to say it could happen. I'm not saying it's a high probability event, but let the blue team win. Have Andrew Yang put in universal basic income, have Stephanie Kelton as the Treasury Secretary, and we're going to print money like crazy. and we're going to have hyperinflation. Okay.
If you have hyperinflation, Lord knows
Is she the
we have.
modern monetary theory?
Yeah, she's the modern
okay,
monetary
gotcha.
theory lady. Yeah.
Just print it all up.
Yeah, just print it. I've got some
I mean,
great.
they're doing it anyway. I think
got-
I'd rather have that than the tax thing.
I've,
She does it, says no taxes, just print it. I think
I've got some great quotes from her in the book. I mean, she's just an idiot. I mean, it's beyond the pale. But
She's not going to be in a position of authority. She's not going to be in charge.
well, does the blue team win? I mean, here's the
Not for 8 years.
Well, hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully
We'll see.
not, but we'll see. I mean, we've got, Trump's got to make a lot of progress. The sane way to fix things, in my view, is to do some kind of a monetary reset, where, as you described, we devalue the dollar versus gold and Bitcoin, and we return to a standard that's based on one of those two things.
So there's a lot happening in the past week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I've been hearing rumblings of that, just even in the past 48 hours of, Trump had this call with Putin. They talked about the dollar. There's all this gold flowing from London coming back to the States. I was hoping to unpack this with probably two of the best people in the world to talk about this with.
Yeah.
So
The thing
educate
is,
us.
I've heard gold bugs talking about an upwards revaluation of the gold price so that the US can pay off its debt with its gold. Because that's the level it reached in 1980, only for an afternoon, but it got to that level. The US and a Zurich banker, when gold went to 850 after the Iranian hostage crisis, and Reagan had just been inaugurated, the US, I think US gold holdings were like one and a third times the value of its debt,
That's
something
correct.
like that.
That's correct.
And a Zurich banker wrote, "The US is solvent again."
Yes.
Only for an afternoon,
Right.
but it's the nature of governments. Whatever the form of money is, they're always insolvent, and they're not.
Of course.
They don't run by the same rules as businesses and
Right.
so on. But like we gold bugs talk about this revaluation, and Bitcoin bugs talk about hyper Bitcoinization. But is anyone in an actual position of power, an official person, talking in these terms?
Well, so let's talk about Bessent and some of the things. He's the new Treasury Secretary, and let's talk about some of the things he said and, what could possibly happen. And by the way, I unfortunately, I don't think, you and I both know that's where we should go. But, as with so many things in government, nothing really happens until there's a crisis. You have to go there, and it's only your last choice. But Scott Bessent's the new Treasury Secretary. Trump picked him. He's a hedge fund manager. His largest holding before he took the position was gold. He is
really?
He's a
that's good.
He is a gold bug guy, and he likes.
So he's incentivized.
He I don't know how much. It's interesting. We'll have to find. We don't know yet because he'll have his financial disclosure. You know how they have to sell a lot of what they have when they take a position. So I don't know, and I don't know if that. They
Gold's funny though because it's a commodity. It's just it's not the same as a company.
You're right. Yeah. No. So when Paulson went in, he had to sell all his stocks, right? And he got that tax free because that's part of the deal they give him. But anyway, long story short, Bessent understands gold, and Bessent understands the debt crisis that we're in. He gets it. He can see it. He understands what's going on. And he said he's dropped these little hints, and they're kind of cryptic, but he has definitely said things like, in June, he said, there's some monetary issues here, and there might be some kind of a need for a restructuring of the world monetary system, a la Bretton Woods, the 1944 restructuring. And if that happens, I want to be at the table. That's interesting.
And this was before he was in the frame.
Before he was in the frame.
This is the point that Craig Shapiro he mentioned the same exact thing yesterday.
Yeah. And so then he also, Bessent has also more recently said, well, we've got a lot of assets and possibly we might want to monetize those. Well, the U.S. has 261 million ounces of gold, theoretically. It hasn't been audited since 53. There are those of us who doubt whether they really have it, but let's assume we do. In theory, they could mark up the price of gold and say, we're tying the dollar to gold. We're going back to a sound money standard. Now, that would have enormous one-time inflationary repercussions on a lot of things. But, the solution to our problem, the problem is the money's unsound. That's the fundamental base layer problem. The solution is we got to go back to a form of money that's sound. How we get from here to there are a lot of paths, and we just don't know. But I'm pleased that we've got a Treasury Secretary. This is brain surgery. It's going to be hard, and people are going to get hurt. Bondholders, there's no way that bondholders don't lose over the next 10 years. I just can't see how anybody holding any sovereign debt of length and duration is going to come out whole in terms of purchasing power. Can't see it. But, if we do a one-time reset where we have a very high inflationary period, but then we go back to sound money, I could see a situation where, things are pretty good. And, Trump cuts deregulation, we cut government expenses, we balance the budget. I mean, there is a path through this. There's an optimistic path through this, but it's not trivial. It's going to be work.
Okay, I'm going to have a discussion with you now, Larry. And I'm going to say to you, like, how does sound money in the 21st century work?
Right.
Because if we want to, I can talk, because I've just written a book about them, about the gold standards of the 20th century and why they failed.
Right.
And this is like, well, the first reason they failed was First World War.
Right.
And then after the First World War, when we returned to the gold standards, they weren't proper gold standards.
Right.
Which is why they failed. They took, in the case of Britain, they took all the sovereigns, all the gold out of the money system. So people, like prior to 1914, a gold sovereign was the pound coin. And so it's all very well saying we were on a gold standard, but physical gold was actually money.
Right.
So it was paper representing gold, but it was also physical gold was in the system. After the World War II, there was no gold in the system. So nominally we were on a gold standard, but we weren't. And then similarly, Americans, after 32, gold was taken out of your money system. So even though you were nominally on a gold standard, Americans couldn't own physical gold. It wasn't a proper gold standard.
Correct.
And it just got steadily worse.
Correct. And
so that's why they failed, because they weren't proper gold standards.
Well, they weren't proper gold standards. And as Lynn points out, technology and fractional reserve banking, as you say, the gold, even though we were theoretically on a gold standard, it wasn't a proper one. And so as a practical matter, what happened is, gold kind of became irrelevant in the monetary system. But even with that, we did have a gold exchange standard. The United States, foreign countries could come to the U.S. with their excess reserves and say, here, we're turning in our reserves, give us the gold. The French tried to do it.
We didn't like that.
We didn't like that. And that's why
Nixon wasn't a fan.
I love this, that the French sent 2 warships to New York to collect their gold. Imagine doing that now, just sending a warship to get your gold.
Yeah, that would not work so well today. And so, and by the way, at that inflection point, things got substantially worse. And the book shows that. I have a chart that shows inflation from 1800 to present. And, there was a lot of inflation at various periods of time. And it's really interesting. One of the things you really come to see is that inflation is used to pay for wars.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Every major war had inflation. 1812, 1865, World War I, World War II, they were all inflationary. And the reason for that is that they cost so much money that you would have to tax the populace at 100%, and the populace isn't going to let you tax them at 100%. No. So they figure out, okay, let's have a war. We're going to have to inflate the money supply, and we'll dilute the beer over a period of time.
I think the act of taking on government spending leads to government debt, which leads to inflation.
Correct. But the point I'm making is that if we can actually get back to a sound money standard, I think it's not for certain, but I think there's an outside chance that really the number of wars we have goes away because they're not affordable.
You can't have wars if the cost of war is immediately felt by the taxpayer, because the taxpayer wouldn't allow it. The only way you can enable a war is the cost can't be felt. Now, there are different ways of doing that: inflation, debt, conquering someone and then taking all their gold.
Right.
But my question, Larry, is how does a sound money standard work? And I as a sort of caveat within that, the reason the gold standards of the 18th century worked was because gold made up a part of it. But people, I know you're slightly backward in the States, but you still use cash. But in Europe, hardly anyone uses cash, and gradually cash is fading out. So gold, you're not going to use. I don't think I've held a physical coin since I've been here. I've certainly held notes, but physical gold is not going to be in day-to-day money like it once was.
Right.
How does a sound money standard work?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, basically, what we're talking about is the base layer of money. What's at the bottom of all of it? And so there has to be exchangeability. And of course, as you refer to in the old classical gold standard days, you could walk into a bank with $20 and give them $20, and they would give you a gold coin. And so that's the way it worked. And really, that principle has to map forward onto the new model. Even though we're paying with credit cards, even though banks have ledgers that are paper credit, at the end of the day, there has to be something underneath it so that when it's called for, it's deliverable.
Yeah, and you have to know you can exchange it if you want to.
Exactly.
It's not just like international governments.
No,
it has to be
it's got to be it's got to be the real damn metal, not paper.
Yeah,
and there's been a big problem with that because as those of us who've been in this area, and you included, know so well, they've created a ton of paper gold. I mean, Summers and Barsky wrote a paper on it called Gibson's Paradox, and that was used by Clinton and Robert Rubin to manipulate the gold market so that Clinton could create inflation, get reelected, make things look good, but have the inflation be hidden by the fact that the gold price wasn't going up. And so that, and they will continue to do that. And by the way, that's somewhat of a risk to Bitcoin. They're mitigating factors that are going to make it much harder to do with Bitcoin. But, and my book details this, that the financial shenanigans, the people who control the financial system can rig it in a way that gets them rich and costs the rest of us. And that's really at the core of the problem, right? That without an honest layer of base money below it that you can exchange for, that that you can exchange for, extra money gets created. Paper credits get created. And those paper credits represent inflation, and therefore we pay more for gasoline and taxes and food.
Do you guys see that ever going back to gold? I mean, just out of curiosity.
I really don't, but I don't know. What do you see?
What do you see, Dominic?
I think a possibility, and I thought it was a bigger possibility 2 months ago than I think it is now, but I think it's a non-American thing. I think it's a Chinese thing where I've studied this at great length, where the Chinese have dramatically understated their gold reserves. And they say they've got 2,000 odd tons. But if you look at gold flows, it's quite easy to see that more than 30,000 tons of gold have made their way to China since 2000. China is the world's largest producer of gold, and it does not export any of the gold that it mines.
It's illegal, right? They made it illegal.
No, you're not allowed to. You can export jewelry, and a lot of the gold they mine gets turned into jewelry, but gold jewelry, China is a net importer. So it's not a thing. And some of that gold is 8,000 tons has come to China through production. And then some of that gold has just been imported via London, Dubai, Switzerland, Hong Kong, and various other places.
Well, they're doing a lot of stuff in Africa too, aren't they?
They have mining operations as well. And their foreign mining operations are almost as big as their domestic, but they're not quite as big yet. But what tends to happen with a mining company is a mining company might directly send its doré bars from Africa back to China if it was Chinese. But normally what happens is the mining company sends its production to a smelter, and then the smelter then sells it for the mining company. Chinese mining companies might not work like that. But in any case, the way to import physical gold is through Dubai, Switzerland, Hong Kong, and London. Now, some of that, what it goes through Hong Kong is just circular. It's money laundering, so it's going back and forth and back and forth. But even if you allow for that, you're still looking at more than 30,000 tons in China. Now, I plant that figure of 30,000 tons because America says it has 8,000 tons, and China's People's Bank of China says it has 2,000 tons. 30,000 tons has made its way to China. So if you just go, well, half of that has gone to the state. It could be more, it could be less. I mean, China does encourage its citizens to own gold, and Chinese citizens are big buyers of gold. But, there's a chance if half of that has gone to the state, then China has twice as much gold as the US. And even since COVID, there's a chap called Jan Neuwenhuis, who's a bit of a sleuth. And you know him?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's fabulous.
He's a great guy. And he's shown that China's, every time... So not all the gold that goes to China, what I've said is just gold that's gone through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. But that's when China imports 400-ounce bars, which is London Good Delivery, they don't go, 400-ounce bars don't go through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. But the People's Bank of China likes 400-ounce bars. And he's shown that China's imported more than 1,000 tons just since Putin's confiscation, clandestine. So he thinks China's understating its gold reserves by 3 times, but there's other guys who think it's by a lot more. But in any case, now
the direction is clear. I mean, they're clearly
importing lots of gold, and the other big gold buyers: Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Russia was a big gold buyer until a few years ago, then it's stopped. But then it's all the stands, and it's all the countries along the Silk Road, all the countries in what's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is something like 30% of the 20% of the global economy, 30% of the land mass, 30% of the population, 40% of the land mass. And they're all countries that do not particularly like the United States and would like to be able to trade with each other, not using the US dollar, not using SWIFT, not using the US dollar banking system. And all the imports have dramatically increased since that confiscation of Russian assets after Putin invaded Ukraine. So we're just going to park all that for a moment. And then we'll just move on to the next sort of factor in all of this. We know these countries are buying lots of gold. We know that money is a weapon of war, always has been. You know, you look at the Civil War and, you know, the Nazis used to print loads of pounds, counterfeit pounds, and use them to buy stuff. The British used to send counterfeit money against the American Revolution. You know, America confiscated Russian.
The Continental.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, money is a tool of war. And if at some point China and America go into some conflict, then money will be a tool of war. And we know that China has a lot more gold than it says it does. We also know that American gold hasn't been audited since 1953, and there's a distinct possibility that not all those 8,000 tons are in Fort Knox. They might have been used in the 60s to prop up the London gold pool. We don't know that for sure. What we do know for sure is that those gold bars are not of good delivery quality, even if they are there. They need refining and resmelting. So if China and the US at some point decide to get in some kind of conflict, you know, if China goes, oh, actually, we've got twice as much gold as you do, and here's the audit, and they're good delivery bars, that's tantamount to a declaration of war on the US dollar. Now, I don't think China is anywhere near ready to say that, because it's got $3 trillion in the bank itself, and it doesn't want to devalue them. And I don't think, you know, for all its ambition, I don't think it's quite ready for a conflict with the United States.
And also we're their biggest customer, right?
Precisely. And, you know, I think China's quite happy to trade with the US and watch it destroy itself, or watch the, you know, and just sit on the sidelines.
Well, all they need to do is get TikTok and just start pushing out all the woke propaganda.
Well, there you go. But the original question was, is there a possibility of going back to some kind of gold standard? Well, we know that the Chinese are a very proud people. They think they're the cleverest people in the world. Everything that's been going on there is all about returning China to its rightful place at the top of the world. It was the foremost nation in the world. It has been 2 or 3 times in history. And that's where China is going. And that's why it's building everything for the world. It's the powerhouse of the world. And it will eventually, maybe not now, but it will eventually want its money to be the global reserve currency. And there has not been at any time ever in all of recorded history a global reserve currency that did not start out backed by gold and sometimes silver, or was interchangeable with gold and silver. There has not been one example ever.
So you think
they've all been debased into oblivion at some point? And China, of course, understands gold. They've all been debased. The dollar's been debased. The pound was debased before it. But they started out as good as gold. And so if at some point China just wants to topple the US or topple the US money system, all it has to go is go, we've got more gold than you. And do you know what? We're going to back the yuan with a little bit of gold, and anyone can just exchange their yuan for gold at any point. So I would say there's a 10, 15% chance of that, 20% chance maybe, but it is a possibility.
I would agree with that. And I think Dominic's done a very good job of laying out facts that I completely agree with. There's no doubt. You can see the Swiss refined gold that's gone into China, and the amounts are massive. I mean, another good one to follow is Ronan Manley. Yeah, and he has the same kind of sets of numbers. So yes, and I think it's possible. I mean, you look at Besant and you look at Trump and you look at, you know, what they're doing. I mean, I've often said that it's very possible that we try a gold standard before we try a Bitcoin standard. I think ultimately Bitcoin is a much better choice. The world needs a neutral reserve currency to address Triffin's dilemma, and the two choices are gold and Bitcoin. Arguably, maybe Bitcoin's not highly valued enough and not technically secure enough to represent, you know, the global reserve standard. But I think in the longer run, I mean, I'm talking 50 years now. I think gold does get demonetized and Bitcoin becomes that reserve standard. And I think there are people in the U.S. government that understand this. Jason Lowery, most particularly, who works in the Pentagon. And, you know, we understand that, you know, just as Britain, you know, leapfrogged India and China when they went off silver and went on gold, sounder money. And India and China suffered as a result of that. If China were to decide they were going to go with the gold standard and we were going to decide we were going to go with a Bitcoin standard, we would actually have a better form of money.
Yeah,
I agree
and
completely.
funnily enough, Bitcoin saves, if the US does not have the gold it says it does,
I think that's the game
Bitcoin
theory.
saves it.
Absolutely.
Because it can go, we've got all these mining operations, we've got all this Bitcoin, we didn't want gold.
Right.
And there's this talk of selling the gold to buy the Bitcoin. Well, it doesn't actually have to sell the gold if it doesn't have it. Just say it sold it.
Well,
I don't know if that is possible.
Well, I think that's right. And they're both candidates for the new neutral reserve currency. And arguably maybe it's some combination of the two.
I was thinking about that too, actually.
It doesn't have to be all.
24 hours.
It doesn't have to be all of one or all of another.
I think you mentioned something about like, was it Bold, or is it called Bold or
Oh,
something?
yeah.
It's like a
This is a friend of mine, Charlie Morris, who's a former fund manager.
Charlie.
He's a great guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
And he's got this product, Bold, which is, I think, 3/4 gold, 1/4 Bitcoin. I might have got the ratio slightly wrong. And it just strips out all the volatility, and it's the most fantastic asset to own because you get the upside of Bitcoin, but the stability of gold.
Yeah.
And it's like the most low vol thing. Funnily enough, people want high volatility. Is one of the reasons MicroStrategy has been so successful. But this is a low volatility, safe asset, and it does like 40-50% a year. It's just been an absolute winner.
It's brilliant. Yeah.
The other thing I would say about Bitcoin is not only does it potentially save the United States, it's a generational thing. And, a lot of the old gold bugs who should like Bitcoin, they don't like it. And the reason they don't like it is partly because they don't understand it. They've never tried out the tech. And partly because the market's just moved so quickly, it's left them behind. And they're sort of slightly bitter almost that Bitcoin's done everything they thought gold or particularly silver was going to do. And so there's this sort of, I don't like it. So there's this generational divide with Bitcoin.
Very much so.
But with these old boys, they're all in the 60s and 70s now. And so, give it another 20 years, the world's going to be full of Bitcoin bugs who are going to be occupying the main positions in government. Whereas the senior people, they're going to be rich. But the senior people in government at the moment might still think Bitcoin's a step too far. Correct. But in 10 or 20 years' time, that won't be the case because of the generational difference.
I think that's exactly what will happen.
Tom Lee from Fundstrat did a thing on this, I think maybe 5 years ago or something, where he was talking about this, and he was talking about how the millennials, my generation, is going into their prime earning years, like now-ish, you know what I mean? And for the next 10 to 15 years are kind of like prime earning years.
25 to 45.
Yeah, right around that, exactly. And there's going to be this transition of wealth, and for my generation, who kind of like grew up in both worlds, one foot in each, the start of the internet, my teens were in the internet, right? So, it just makes sense. It just makes complete sense. And if I had to put everything on it, I would say it's obvious to me that Bitcoin will be the new base money, pristine collateral reserve asset for the world. It just makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think what you talked about with China doing all this, they want to pre-plan everything 100 years in advance. I think part of the benefit that we have as Americans, as the great American experiment, is we can adapt more quickly. It's not top-down control on everything. And I think the game theoretical play is to do exactly what you just said, whether we have the gold or not or whatever. It's just so obvious to me that Bitcoin is going to be a part of this future, this geopolitical future.
Yeah, I don't know how much foresight the Chinese government has, because we sort of imbue them, because they've grown so incredibly, we imbue them with all these qualities. But at the end of the day, it's a big government, and you know how corrupt and incompetent big governments are. It doesn't matter who makes them up. But, at one point, something like 90% of Bitcoin mining was in China.
Right.
And you don't know how much, some of that will have got sold in order to fund the mining, but how much of that Bitcoin went to the Chinese government? We won't know this for ages, but it wouldn't surprise me if the Chinese government had got a shitload of Bitcoin.
Yeah, they're not stupid, so it wouldn't surprise me. But listening to what they've said, I do think they've made much more of a gold bet. I think the more likely of, if you look at our political adversaries, and I consider China and Russia to be our two big political adversaries, I think Russia is much more likely to hold a strategic Bitcoin reserve than China. Putin has said things that indicate that he fully understands.
He does.
He's talked about distributed ledgers and all the rest of it.
He gets it. He realizes, he said once, you can't kill this thing. It's happening. And so, and they also have some very low cost energy. So, and we've seen some guys who look at hash very carefully say there's significant hash coming out of Russia. And my gut would be that might be the government, mining it and hanging on to it. So
2 or 3 years ago, there was a plane and flown from Moscow to Iran, and it had 2 tons of gold on it. And it was the money, some hackers found this out, The money was used to buy Iranian drones, which Russia then used in the war in Ukraine.
Interesting. I didn't know.
So, like, I couldn't believe that Russia was buying physical gold to settle debts with Iran. But I guess that's the problem. I mean, it's so cumbersome and impractical. But I guess that's the situation in which both those countries found themselves in, shut out of the financial system.
And they don't
But I trust each other.
Well, exactly, that too. But I mean, Bitcoin's so much more efficient.
Yeah, right. 10 minutes, a couple of mouse clicks, bingo.
It's like a physical letter to email. Just like, both are still useful and have value, but you just see in the way the world is evolving and the way things are changing, just I think there's a huge advantage with they're both bearer assets, but the digital bearer asset of Bitcoin, I think, is so much more powerful and strategic, especially for the stuff we talked about earlier, where, when Hitler invaded, he went right to the gold reserves and tried to get those physical things, right? Where, like, with Bitcoin, you can have like 7 out of 11, a multi-sig key where you have to have all 7 people that work for the whatever to unlock the wallet, right? So, and you don't even know who those people are to access the.
They're just, the problem with gold is there's just so many. It's centralized. People can lie about what they have. It's hard to verify.
Yeah,
you've now got these tungsten plated gold bars.
I was telling him about that.
Right? I mean,
is that in Canada? What can you tell me about that?
Well, the little that I know about it is the Chinese have figured out how to make good fake gold bars. Where they would plate them, and they would knock off the what it's called, the watermark or whatever it is, that when the Swiss refiners, I think Switzerland is the leading refiner in the world of gold. And when they do that, they put a little stamp in the hot molten metal that says Harrius or whoever the refiner was. And apparently the Chinese have figured out how to do that. Tungsten has the very close to the same atomic weight as gold. And so there were, fake gold kilo bars being shipped around. And I know this personally from experience. I have friends who had kilo bars, and they turned into Bitcoiners. So they were selling their gold. Okay. Well, they would take their kilo bar to a dealer, and the dealer would say, I'm sorry, I'll take this, but 2 things. One, I got to saw it open to make sure it's real all the way through. And then once it's sawed open, of course, it's no longer a solid bar. I've got to pay, you have to pay a resmelting fee, right? Because we got to send it back to Switzerland to get them to remake it, with the dust that we used in the saw and so forth. So there's just so many problems with it.
And the assayability is difficult.
All of it. And so, when you've got a digital asset, you can see the address, all they have to do is prove by moving a little out of the address that they control the address. And, bing, bang, you've got, I remember back in the early days people were talking about Bitcoin, the advantages, it's triple entry accounting. You got a debit and an asset, on the ledger, but you also got something that somebody can see, that an outsider can see. And that's huge.
Yeah. Did you ever see I think it was Nick Szabo posted on X many, many years ago, but it was like the physical dollar note, and he put them all every couple of years, how they boiled the frog over generations of, breaking that, physical redeemability.
Redeemable for $5.
Like redeemable for $5, redeemable for $10, redeemable, it was like slowly.
Suddenly Federal Reserve note.
Then it goes, it's like
US dollar.
No, it was like redeemable for this, and then less, and then less, and then all of a sudden it said, "In God we trust." That was like classic.
The UK pound note says, "I promise to pay the bearer the sum of £20 on a £20 note." But it's like £20 of what? So it's a promise of nothing.
Well, let me ask you a question. Would you rather have a 20 pounds of gold or 20 pounds of feathers or other things? Which one weighs more? What was it? Can you explain that? One of you guys got to know that, because I don't know.
Well, they use
explain it to me.
It's ounces, and the ounces that you measure gold with, the troy ounce, is different to the standard ounce.
Right.
I think 20 ounces of feathers is heavier. An ounce of feathers is heavier than an ounce of gold.
Okay, that's what I wanted to understand.
Yeah, but that's just
an accounting.
It's a troy ounce versus a metric ounce, and that's all. And that's why it's
What's the explanation or justification of that?
Ounces, the ounce that we use that in standard measurements is just not the same as the ounce that was used in gold. Gold was measured in carats and in grains and so on, and the two evolved differently, and the two markets
A troy ounce and
because gold was always measured in troy.
Ounce are slightly different.
Yeah, but you wouldn't say a metric. You would say we would say an imperial ounce. I think you'd say an English ounce. Would you say an English ounce? You call it English weights and measures. Your system of weights and measures.
I guess we'd say.
And it's just that ounce was standardized at one weight, and the troy ounce that was used in the metal markets was just standardized at a different weight.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I want to hear you talk about these different ounces or these different measurements. You've got some interesting takes on this about why the American system is better than the metric system.
Oh, it's much better.
Explain
but
it
Americans are always very down on their own system. But what you have to understand is the American system of weights and measures, which you call English weights and measures, it is not a system. It's not a design system. It's the result of it's a process that has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's like a market process, and your system of weights and measures is the outcome. And so, in the days before we had scales and rulers and all the rest of it, people, when they were measuring stuff, just used to use the most immediate system of measure that they had to hand, which was the human body. And so that's why we use feet, which is a foot has since been standardized at what you would have an English size 10 shoe, a US size 11 shoe with a shoe on is a foot. And it's just a remarkably consistent measure. And an inch is a thumb pressed down. And a hand is 4 inches. And a span is 6 inches. And a yard is a pace. And so they're all very practical measures designed around the human body. And the human body is not a system, but we all understand it. Whereas, and similarly, a pound is the amount that you can carry comfortably. If I gave you a certain amount of apples, I said, how many apples can you carry? And you'd carry that amount in your hand, it would be exactly a pound. A pound is just what you can carry in your hand comfortably. And it's the oldest measure in the world. If you look at the Babylonian Mesa, it was pretty much identical to what is a pound today.
Interesting.
And whereas if you look at metric weights and measures, a centimeter, like it's a very simple, comprehensible system based around the number 10. But a meter bears no actual resemblance to anything around us in the real world. Similarly, the same goes for an inch. If you took a water pipe, and you shoved your finger in it, it would block the pipe. And that's because the pipe is an inch pipes are just an inch. It's just a really good practical thing. And metric weights and measures, the system was designed in the lead up to the French Revolution, where because at every town and city that you went to in France, they would have their own system of weights and measures. Huh. And so everyone was just, had their own little cup based on the local weights and measures. And it was total chaos. But as a result of it, and this is why every ruler you read about in history, they're always trying to standardize weights and measures, because it makes everything easier to tax if you have one standard weights and measure. But in fact, one of the reasons you have so much architectural regional diversity in the olden times, not now, is because every town would have its own feet and its own yard based on the measures of the people around it. And it's actually a rather beautiful thing. But and so proportion, we find the human body, the proportions of the human body attractive, either because, it's a biological thing that we find the human body attractive, or because the human body is made in God's image and so therefore it's divine. It doesn't matter what the reason is, we find the human body attractive. And English weights and measures are derived from the human body. And so when I keep looking at American buildings, they're so much more beautiful. Modern American domestic architecture is so much more beautiful than anything gets built anywhere else in the world. And it's because proportion is built into it. You cannot not build something in proportion, because all the weights and measures are proportional. Whereas when something's built with metric, unless you deliberately plan to build something that has the proportions of the human body, there's no inbuilt proportion. That's why modern non-American architecture is so phenomenally ugly, because it's all built around metric. And so the system started, France decided it wanted to standardize weights and measures, and it wanted a weights and measures system. Instead of having a system of weights and measures based around the human body, it decided it was going to have a system of weights and measures built around the earth itself. And it was going to be a universal system of weights and measures for all time. And they sent out these 2 scientists to measure the distance from the North Pole to the equator. Okay, and they were going to measure the distance, and then they were going to base the meter on this distance. But they couldn't get to the equator and they couldn't get to the North Pole. So instead, they did it from Dunkirk to Barcelona and they were going to extrapolate it from there. So right away, you've got an inaccuracy straight away. And so one guy went from Paris to Dunkirk and he measured it okay. The other guy went south to Barcelona and made his way from Barcelona back to Paris. And this bloke had an absolute nightmare. He was, they thought because he had this device for measuring distance, what do they call it, like a sextant.
Yeah.
He ran into loads of trouble. He kept they thought he was a witch in one town. They thought he was a tax assessor in another town. He kept getting arrested. He had all his money stolen off. He had a total nightmare. And in the end, he just fudged the data. He made it up.
Sounds familiar.
And he just guessed it. And as it happens, he guessed it really quite accurately.
Really?
So the meter was going to be 1/1,000,000th of the distance, and they from the Arctic Circle from the North Pole to the equator, but it's like out by about 1.5 kilometers. They got it nearly right, but they didn't get it exact. So the fundamental measure on which a meter is based is fraudulent. And then you look at every country, like the only countries in the world that still use the old tradition of weights and measures is the United States, Liberia, and Myanmar. So they are the 3 countries in the world with strong enough national cultures to withstand the onslaught of metric. And there are big campaigns to try and get America to adopt metric, particularly in the 70s they tried it. But you look at every country that's adopted metric, it's always come after a revolution or some kind of huge amount of political upheaval. It's always followed.
Has the UK gone metric?
We're the only country that attempted to do it without the revolution, and we've got this sort of hypocritical halfway house thing where we still use miles.
You still have miles and kilometers.
Yeah, we still use
some kilometers, but you use miles.
Well, we use miles mostly, and I actually weigh myself in kilos, but it's only because my weights are set in kilos. And in fact, if you carried on using pounds and ounces to measure fruit, you got arrested. They were trying to impose kilos that much. But most people don't use the kilo. Most people use the half kilo. It's just a much more practical weight, the 500 grams of this, 500. And then you realize that a half kilo is pretty much a pound.
Yeah.
And so what's happened is all the old traditional weights and measures are making their way back into the metric system, though by a different name.
That's fascinating.
And the litre, the international thing of weights and measures has found that a litre is just a fraudulent measure. So they've actually withdrawn it. And altogether, again, by the back door. And again, the pint, what you have the pint, 16 ounces, it's just it's like a pint is a pound of water. That's why you call it a pint. The words are the same.
What about a mile? What's this?
I'll tell you about a mile in a second. And a pint of water, a pint of water, a US pint, is the amount of water you need to drink to quench your thirst. It's just a really natural amount. And, you should drink a pint of water in the morning. And a mile is 1,000 paces. This is where it comes from. So if you imagine when you're a Roman army, you go, a pace is a yard. But when you're marching, you don't go left, right. You go left, right, left. So a pace to a Roman would be left, right, left. So 2 paces. And 2 paces is 5 feet. Okay? And a mile, the original Roman mile, was 1,000 5 feet paces.
5,286 feet.
Well, it is that now, but originally it was 5,000 feet.
Interesting. Huh?
And that's where it came from. And similarly, a fathom is 6 feet.
Right.
And 6 feet is my arms outstretched. And the distance from the end of my nose to the end of my hand would be a yard. and so the distance from the king's nose to the end of his fingers would be the king's yard, and that would be the yard for while that guy was king. But we have a fathom. Why is a fathom 6 feet? And we use that to measure depth. It's because when you're dropping rope into the sea, you're doing that with the rope, and you can quickly measure by doing that. That's why a fathom is a measure of depth.
Interesting.
And you look at every single traditional way to measure, and there is a very logical, practical reason why we use that measure. We've forgotten the reason, and that's the way with tradition. You forget that you might not understand why the tradition exists, but you should still respect the fact that the tradition exists, because it is a tradition. Just because you don't understand it, that's no reason to do away with it. You should understand the tradition, and then once you understand the tradition, then you're in a position to do away with it.
I'm fascinated every time I get this guy going on all this stuff. That's why,
stuff, right? I didn't know a lot of that.
Right? No, you're gonna.
And yeah, Americans all give themselves a hard time about your system of weights and measures. They go, it makes no sense. I don't understand it. And there's like this Saturday night skit that does the rounds with everyone taking the piss out of it. It's a brilliant system. It's a much more organic and sensible system of weights and measures than metric.
Interesting.
I'm gonna keep you here while I got you going on these down these rabbit holes. We're talking a little bit about gold, and I know you got some great Greek myths about gold. The Midas touch, Achilles.
I can talk about. I don't know about Achilles, but I can certainly talk about the Midas touch. But why don't you, Lawrence? You tell us, because I've just talked for about 15 minutes nonstop.
I don't know where you want to go. I can't top that because I don't have that kind of historical knowledge about something.
But I guess what I wanted to tie in was like where coinage, the river that coinage was first formed in, right? The Lydian kings of like where they first like made gold, silver. They kind of like found it and turned it into coins. A lot of the Greek mythology originates around that river. And I know I've heard you talk about it somewhere. I don't remember where, but I was just fascinated by it.
So one of the most famous Greek myths is the myth of Midas, who had the Midas touch. Everything he touched, he turned to gold. It was one of the later Greek myths. By the way, the Trojan War, first war in history, apparently, was started over a row about gold, the golden apple. But so what's his name? Dionysus was the god of revelry, and he was having a big party, going through Midas's kingdom, and his tutor falls asleep in Midas's garden, and Dionysus goes off, and he wakes up with this terrible hangover, and Midas nurses him back. Takes him 10 days to get his health back, and eventually his tutor goes back to Dionysus, and Dionysus is delighted to find his tutor again, and he says to Midas, "You can have any wish you like." And Midas says, I wish that everything I touch turns to gold. And Dionysus goes, "You sure?" And Midas goes, "Yeah." So he goes back home and he touches a rock and it turns to gold. And he's, winner. And then he goes into his rose garden where he used to walk with his beloved daughter, and he touches the roses and all the roses turn to gold. And he's really happy. And he throws a big banquet to celebrate. And he starts eating his food, and the food all turns to gold, and he suddenly realizes he's got a problem. And then his daughter comes in crying, and she's like, Dad, the rose garden, all the roses have turned to gold. So he hugs her, and then he turns to his daughter to gold, and he's absolutely devastated. So he goes back to Dionysus. He says, free me of this curse. So Dionysus says, go and wash your hands in the river, and you'll be freed of this curse. And so he washed his hands of the river, and the power of his to turn things to gold went into the riverbed, into the sands of the bottom of the river. And this was the river Pactolus, which flowed through Lydia, which today is Turkey. And most Greek myths have, like most myths, at one point it was a current affair. And then from current affair it becomes history. And then from history, it becomes legend and myth. If you look at sports, the sports stars of your childhood, they're gods now.
Right.
But in your childhood, there was just a baseball player or something.
Yeah.
And so Midas did actually exist. And one of his descendants was this chap called King Aliates. And the Greek historian Hesperides said that the ancient Lydians were the first people to mint coins. And Aliates was the first to mint coins, and he minted them with the electrum, the gold-silver alloy, that was panned from the river Pactolus, which was the same river into which Midas had passed his power. And then King Aliates' son was a chap called Croesus. And Croesus famously, his innovation was to separate the gold and silver in electrum and make gold coins and silver coins. And he put his there was a sort of, they were embossed with a stamp so that people knew it was genuine.
The mint.
They weren't putting their own heads on coins at this point. But
was it like a cow or something like that?
Yeah, if you look at the coins now, they just look like blobs, really. But these were the first coins. Now, if you think about it, coinage is one of probably the most long-lived, successful technology, certainly the most long-lived, successful financial technology in all of history. This is 700 AD. Here we are in 2025. So nearly 3,000 years we've been using coins for. Obviously, they got steadily better. But coins were wonderful because they gave people mobility. Because suddenly people could travel They could bring their wealth with them. And it just enabled trade to spread, commerce to spread, and then it's through trade and exchange that we progress and all the rest of it. But Croesus was the first person to, he had the first international coinage, if you like. And that's where we get the expression as rich as Croesus. And yeah, it's just a wonderful, brilliant technology, but it has its roots in this Greek myth. It was where Midas washed his hands.
I found that fascinating.
That is fascinating.
Larry, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Recently, you've described yourself as gone full crazy orange pill while still maintaining significant gold investments.
Yeah.
How do you advise people to think about balancing both of these? I know we kind of touched on it a little bit today, but
yeah. So, it's interesting. We talked earlier about, I think privately, about kind of the weightings and so forth. And actually, you mentioned Charlie Morris's fund where he's 75% gold and 25% Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
I actually kind of think they're becoming the new equivalent of bonds and equities, where gold is the bond and Bitcoin is the equity.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in the sense that, and it fits too in terms of the risk profile. I mean, historically, bonds were lower risk, lower return,
Mm-hmm.
less volatility. Equities had growth opportunities, and therefore the returns were higher, but they were more volatile and more risky. And those characteristics kind of carry over into gold, into Bitcoin and gold. And so what I have a lot of clients, and these clients are wealthy, and they own gold and they own Bitcoin. And what I advise them to do, is to look at them in those terms, in that, the advantage of Bitcoin is it's got a lot more alpha. I think it's going to continue to outperform gold. It's going to really bury gold over a longer period of time. But the disadvantage of Bitcoin is if you're 80 years old and you've got a lot of wealth and you were to put all your money into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin were to go through one of its typical 4-year down cycles, you could see a drawdown of, historically they've been as high as 70%. I don't think we'll see any more of those. I think we're becoming more broadly distributed, but 50% is certainly in the cards, possibly, maybe 40. And, if you're a very rich person, you have all your money in Bitcoin, it draws down 40%. And, maybe you're in later years. And so you're thinking, I might need to use some of that money. You need to draw on it. But you wouldn't want to be selling it during a drawdown, right? The largest, I've looked at this, the largest drawdown in modern times in the gold market came right after the peak in 1980. There was a year when gold was down 30%. So even that is smaller than the largest Bitcoin drawdown, which is the first cycle went through. It was down 90%.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you're older and have all your money in Bitcoin, you get a 90% drawdown. That's going to be really bad, right? And more recently, gold is up in 2/3 of the years that it's traded. And in the 1/3 where it's down, it's typically down single digits. So, so you've got a much less volatile form of sound money. And for people, I think everyone just has to choose their risk preference, right? If I were 30 years old and I didn't care, and I knew my savings were, for my much later years, I didn't have a chance of having to need them, I'd probably be almost 100% allocated to Bitcoin.
It's pretty much where I'm at.
Yeah, right. And a lot of people are there.
I do own a little gold, but
yeah, a lot of people are there, and I get it. And that's what I would do too. But if you were 80 years old, I would say, maybe the profile looks different for you. You don't want to have 100% of your assets in Bitcoin. That's not a wise way to approach it. So they're both forms of sound money. It's just that one is a sound money that will protect you from inflation, and one is a sound money that will really grow your purchasing price because of the adoption curve. And so, in the book, what I say is, I think anybody who doesn't have 25% of their assets in sound money alternatives is going to feel regret in the next 10 years, because I think we've lived through a big 40-year deflationary cycle. There were a lot of things that drove that. Technology, the China coming online and providing a lot of low-cost goods, Volcker having tightened rates and just seeing a downward trend. In 2020, we broke out of that, clearly broke out of that. I think we now live in an inflationary world where we have monetary chaos. The chaos they started to create in 2008 has really caught up with us. It got worse in 2009, and now it's caught up with us. And so I tell people that, look, if you don't have 25% of your assets in something that's sound, that will not get debased, in an inflationary world, you're likely to experience serious regret in the next 10 years. And in many cases, I recommend higher than that. But, people like to own real estate. People like to own equities. There are lots of assets. And, some people say, well, why aren't you 100% Bitcoin? And it's just because you just never know. Anyone who's studied investment history, thousands of years, is smart enough to recognize that we all never really know. We don't know what we don't know. And, tomorrow there could be some flaw discovered in the Bitcoin, protocol and blockchain. I don't think it's just likely to happen.
Highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely given 16 years and 850,000 blocks. But But the point is there are always things that could change or go wrong.
Yeah.
And therefore you don't want to have necessarily all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, and it's so age related because
That's right.
you know, I think if you want to make money, you go all in on one thing and make sure you pick the right thing. And that thing you go all in on might be you.
Right.
Or it might be your business or
Right.
whatever it is. But when you're older, you want a bit of diversification, you want a bit of real estate, a bit of cash, a bit of this, a bit of that.
Right.
And so, you know, that's why.
Right. And with my clients, I'm not trying to get them to become full on crazy Bitcoiners. I'm trying to get them to get off of zero because I've said this in the book and I really strongly believe this. You know, I've been doing this for 40 years and I've made all the money I've made as an investor in buying asymmetric bets. And by asymmetric bet, I mean something where you can, if you're wrong, you'll lose your money. And I've done that plenty of times. But if you're right, you're not just going to make 10%. You're going to make 2x, 3x, 5x, 10x, 20x. And I can see
That's a great point.
I can see Bitcoin being a 20 to 100x investment over the next 15 years.
Even from here, from 100 grand.
Easily. Yeah.
Tell me more.
Yeah, right.
If the fund, I mean, again, the dollar over 15 years has lost 99.99% of its purchasing power relative to Bitcoin. So, I mean, the monetary policies are completely different. One is just actively printing more and more every time they, reinflate the bubble. And the other one is the complete opposite. So, I mean, I theoretically, I think.
But I mean, it's every double is harder than the last.
Yes, but let me in the how early are we bucket, because I think you'll find this interesting. Maybe you focus on it, Dominic, maybe you haven't, but there are 900 trillion. This is the Jesse Meyer chart, which I think is brilliant.
It's unbelievable.
There are $900 trillion of what we would call investable assets, and that's called 450 of that's real estate. Okay. The other 450 is a combination of stocks, cash, and bonds. Okay. Those are all the investable assets in the world. Bitcoin, so that's 450 trillion of fiat related investable assets. And there's a 2 trillion market cap for all the Bitcoin that exists. Okay. So basically, if you do it by the 900, it's 0.2% of the investable assets in the world are in Bitcoin. It's pretty low for the soundest form of money that's ever been created, right? So in my view, Bitcoin could easily go up 10x from here. We could be at $1 million a coin, and still you'd only be at 2%.
You're at like gold's market cap.
Yeah, of total investable assets. And so, and I think over time, when everybody on a mass scale understands that this is money that cannot be diluted. I mean, that's the thing that I try to get across in the book is just how unusual this thing is. And that's why I think so many people have a hard time getting their head around it. What they don't understand, it'd be like trying to explain to a caveman that, we have airplanes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really...
When you look at that chart that you're describing, I mean, the misallocation of capital too, there's I could be wrong, but I could swear it was like almost 90 trillion allocated to like negative yielding bonds or some shit like in the
I don't think it's that big. I think at its peak the negative yielding bonds were about 17 trillion.
Okay, I might be exaggerating.
But I mean, I look at some of these
these
$20 million houses that people are hanging out in, and I'm like, it's just a bunch of sticks.
Yeah.
And it's a nice big house, but
I was looking at some of those yesterday in the window.
Yeah, I wouldn't pay $20 million for it.
I was looking. I mean, I was thinking it was nice, but I didn't think it was $20 million nice.
Exactly. And so the point.
So where do they get the money to buy that?
Well, you actually touch on this.
They're fiat lords. I mean, they borrowed at 0%. They're cantillionaires. They borrowed at 0% and invested in yielding assets. I mean, the book talks about that too. I mean,
that game's gone.
It will be. Yes, it will be. But I mean, when
we don't go back to the disinflation pre-COVID.
No, I totally agree. Completely.
There was a question. So
no, I don't think we do. No, I think there's no way that that's going to last because we're in a sovereign debt crisis. I mean, I really do believe that game is gone. Now, maybe they'll try and start it again and we'll go back to 0% interest rates. But the reason all these prices are so distorted is that the money was distorted. I mean, my book has some great anecdotes about this. I mean, private equity, I mean, if you allow somebody to borrow money at 0% interest and invest it in 10, 15, 20% yielding assets, how do you not get filthy rich?
Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing game.
So where does real estate go?
I think it comes down substantially because I think it gets demonetized. Now, I think
you touch on this in your book.
I think it does better than fiat because, it is a tangible asset and there is a limited supply of it. I mean, so as Saylor says, I mean, look, I mean, a waterfront house is a waterfront house. There are only so many of them. There'll be rich people. They'll want, they'll want it and they'll pay for it. But I think on a relative basis, some of the monetary premium is going to come out of that high-end real estate and go into things like Bitcoin, which are, they don't have property taxes. They're easy to move.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, they don't get hit by hurricanes, right? I mean,
You don't have all these costs.
yeah, you don't have all
associated
you don't
with
have
it.
all the
That's like
you
pain in
don't
the ass.
you don't have all the associated costs.
It's a nightmare.
So you know, to me, as he says, this is pristine digital capital. It's like buying Bitcoin today is like buying, you know, part of Manhattan in the 1700s. And
Yeah.
there's no doubt that whoever was buying Manhattan in the 1700s thought that the people who were buying it in the 1600s got a better deal.
Okay.
You know, and the people in the 1800s thought
Yeah.
the 1700s. You know, what I'm
That's the
saying?
way I think about it as well.
Yeah,
So I tell people when it comes to our meetup, I just say, listen, just get on your,
Yeah.
should I buy now? Should I buy then? Should I buy now? Just dollar cost average.
Well, that's
it's dollar
that's
cost
another
average.
point. That's another point I want to make that I think is really important, and that is, so I deal with a lot of friends who, you know, and they know I've been in this for a long time. I bought my first ones at 400, and they're just kind of like they're TradFi guys, and they're having a hard time. They're kind of like, well, shit, Larry, I don't want to pay $100,000 for something you bought for 400. I mean, I'm happy for you, but Jesus Christ, I'm overpaying. I can't do that. And I say, you guys, you're looking at this from the wrong angle. Okay, let's do the different model. The monetary system based on the compounding of the debt and everything else is the Titanic. Okay, and so sound money, Bitcoin and gold, those are the lifeboats. Okay, now I got a seat in the lifeboat for 400, and I got some for 15,000. I got some for 50,000, and guess what? The seat now costs 100. Do you want it or not? your choice. You know, it's 100,000 to you. What do you want to do? Right? Because in 5 or 10 years,
could be $1 million.
Exactly. And you're going
2
to,
billion.
yeah.
5
And
billion.
people are going to say, you mean to tell me you own a whole coin? You mean to tell me I mean, just like I was always stunned when I, you know, would talk with Max and he'd say, yeah, I bought a lot of it at $1. And I'm like, oh my God, you know, and by the way, he felt he'd overpaid. I talked to him about it. Trace Meyer was getting it 50 cents. Right. and so everybody, when they buy Bitcoin, thinks they're paying too much for it. Everybody. But it's like, let the value, let time go by, let compounding go by. And, you know, the power law, I mean, are you familiar with the power law? Have you looked into it? Oh, we should talk about this. So there's something called the power law. A guy named Stanistasi and Fred Krueger both went on Twitter and talked a lot about it. They basically went and they looked at a log of time and a log of price from inception to now on Bitcoin. And they were able to actually draw a curve based on the logs that they found that explained 97% of the price movement of Bitcoin. I mean, that's an R squared. That was correlation. Now it moved around the curve, but you know, you know, a statistical model that can explain 97% of the movement of a series, that's valid. Okay. And if you look at that going forward, and it's my downside case, because if we get hyper-Bitcoinization, we're going to break that model to the upside. Like Saylor says, all your metals will be broken. But if you just take that model and look at it on a go-forward basis, you know, we hit, you know, 300 in a few years, and then we hit 700 a few years after that, and then we hit 1 million after that. I mean, it's going to keep on doing what it's been doing. I mean, I can't see what really deflects it, changes it.
As adoption grows, as its use case gets more apparent.
I mean, I know you're looking at me like, Jesus, Larry, you're crazy, but I'm going to find that power law in this book because it's quite a powerful model.
Yeah, look for that, Larry.
Can I ask you a question while you're looking for it?
Yep, sure.
We were talking, Matty and I, yesterday with Craig Shapiro.
He's great. Yeah,
he is great. And he was talking about the importance of the 10-year treasury yields.
Yes.
And how they want to get them down. And they want a weaker dollar.
Power law model.
Okay.
Page
293. Where do you think 10-year yields go?
Well, so, you know, the U.S. federal government has so many games they can play. And yes, they do want to get them down. And, you know, as an example, it's being talked about that maybe one of the things Trump is doing with his tariffs is he's saying, you guys got to be buying more of our treasuries or else we're going to hit you with tariffs, right? So they want to get them down. But without government interference, left alone, with more debt coming and everyone becoming aware of the sovereign debt crisis that we're living in, I think 10-year yields are going to go much higher over time. And I think eventually the Fed is going to be forced into a form of yield curve control. The entire bond market is going to look at it and say, you know, the Fed's going to realize that if interest rates go too high, we do get into that debt spiral, the deficits become too large and things just don't work.
Real estate crashes.
Everything crashes. And so what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to realize that they're going to have to say, you know what, we're going to tolerate higher inflation in order to keep the system together. And the way we're going to do that is like what we did after World War II. I mean, after World War II, we had the same kind of debt to GDP that we have today. And what they did was they forced people into buying or holding bonds that were yielding well below market. And those people got hurt, but they just did it. And they grew their balance sheet in order to do it. And, fortunately after that time they were able to grow out of it because we had automobiles and the GIs came home and bought a lot of shit. But the point is that I think we're going to go to a situation where the Fed has to buy the bond market, and that's really just printing money and creating more money, which will be inflationary, but at least it'll keep the system going. So that's why, to me, the fact that we have inflation in our future, there's nothing else I feel more confident about right now economically.
Then that yields are going up.
Yeah.
Own hard assets.
Yeah, and own hard assets. Yeah, yields are going up.
So I'm looking at this. So what they want them down.
I know that, but the market's the market. I mean, if you're, the sucker at the table right now, the sucker at the card table in this financial system is the bondholder, right? I mean, in a system that's designed to create inflation or else the system blows up, which is what we have.
Yeah.
You have to basically, have inflation and debase the currency and debase the bonds. So the bondholder is the sucker at the card table. And guess what? The bondholder's waking up to the fact that he or she is the sucker at the bond table and saying, I don't want to hold these things anymore. And
sorry, sir, you're not allowed to. In order to have your bank have its AAA rating, you need to have this much government.
And they're in using the tariffs as a clause.
That's another one. That's for the foreign countries.
And maybe there are a lot of things they could do. They could come to us all and saying, look, we're in a financial crisis. You all have IRA accounts that are tax free. Guess what? If you want to maintain that tax free status, you got to use that. Half of that account has to be in Treasury bonds.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they could come and say that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. Hell, they grabbed all our gold in '93.
I wouldn't be surprised.
I mean, so we don't know what moves they will use to try and keep the bond market intact, to try and keep the system going.
Mm-hmm.
But those kinds of things, I'm sure, have been thought about and are potentially on the table because they've got a problem.
Mm-hmm.
They've got the problem is the spending. Now, if Dominic is right, and pray that he is, and that Musk does his thing, and we find trillions of dollars of waste and we balance the budget, well, that's a different case.
Yeah, okay. That's what I was going to ask you is that's
a different case.
How can you thread the needle through all of everything that's happening?
That's why I'm glad we have Besant as Treasury Secretary, because he's a really smart guy.
Yeah, he is.
And he's got, and this is brain surgery.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
Yeah. I mean, he understands this stuff extremely well. He was the guy working for Druckenmiller, working for Soros, who broke the pound, which was a trade that made Soros as rich as he is. It made him billions and billions of dollars. And so he gets it. He understands what the problem is with this monetary system. And I think what he's going to try and do, obviously, is thread the needle and try to, balance all competing needs, keep the system together. But I think, based on the math, there's no way that's not inflationary. Now, he wants to avoid hyperinflation, and he will. But he also wants to avoid a collapse and a downturn, and he will. And my sense is what will happen is, Powell will be gone in May of next year. And they'll put a lot of pressure on them to cut rates, and they'll use the banks to buy all these bonds in the interim. They'll take away the supplementary reserve ratio. Did Craig talk about that? The SLR going away?
He did not talk about that.
Yeah, but they got a lot of levers they can pull to kind of keep it holding together. But then Powell will be gone, and then they'll appoint somebody they want, and that will be somebody who will drop interest rates, let inflation run hot in anticipation of a transition back to a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard. So I think that's the sensible way out, but we'll just have to see how it unfolds. It's going to be messy.
I'm looking at this power
law, right?
The power law, and I'm looking at when was this published? This
was last summer,
2024?
Yeah, June.
So Bitcoin was at 68 grand at the point,
right?
And so he said, okay. And so he said, in a year from now, if it sits on the trend line, it'll be 97, which is kind of where it is.
Where it is, right? And
okay. And if one standard up, it would be 200 grand.
Right. And go, yeah. But
and then on the trend line, 5 years from now, it'll be 320.
Right.
And if the trend line fails and we go one standard down, it goes to 160 in 5 years from now, which wouldn't be
sounds about right.
Yeah.
But if you go two standards up, and presumably it's gone two standards up at times.
It does. Sometimes it goes two standards up, and sometimes it goes one half down. I mean, we got down to 15 when that was a couple. That was way down. But read out the numbers. I mean, where is it in 5 and 10 years, right? I mean,
well, if it's two standards up in 5 years, which is only not even 4.5 now, 4 years and 4 months or something, it goes to 1,800. In 10 years, it goes to 6 million.
Right.
When I say 1,800, I mean 1.8 million.
Yeah.
Right.
And in 20 years, it goes to 40 million.
Yeah.
Right. But that's the upside. That's the crazy dream. Just do the baseline. What is the baseline?
The baseline is 68 last July. So it will be 97 this coming July.
Kind of where we are. Right?
Yeah. So let's just assume it goes range trades between now and July, which is not an unreasonable
Sounds logical.
situation.
Definitely.
I think because we're in a halvening year, it could do a bit better than that. But I was hoping for 150 this year, but you never know.
I think
And just because I'm hoping for that, that's not what this is. And so 1 year, 97, 5 years from now, 5 years from last July,
Trend
326.
Right.
That's on the trend line. 10 years from last July, 1.1 million.
Right.
And 20 years from last.
That's my downside case. That's my
Your downside case is that the trend line hold.
Yeah, that's my downside case too. I mean, historically, Bitcoin's done on it. It averages 62% per year.
Powerful. And I mean, 97% correlation looking back historically. So
we'll all have riverfront houses in Naples.
Well, if that's what you want. I mean, that doesn't really do much for me, but yeah. I mean, it's, everybody talks. It's funny. I don't have many fiat demands. All I want to be able to do is eat good steak. I talk about that when I talk about there will be signs, it'll be Larry eating a ribeye.
I think I'm a bit like, in that regard, I think I'm a bit like, I want to know that I can swap my money for gold if I want to. I want to know that I can have the 20 million Riverside house if I want it. But in fact, I don't actually want it.
Exactly. I mean, who wants that crap? I mean, it's a burden, not a reward. But yeah, I mean, look, and more importantly, if we get back to the sound money standard, things get fair again. I mean, I wrote the book because, and I mean, you're close to my age. You're not. I mean, this was a country that had a middle class when I was growing up. And it really doesn't now.
What the fuck happened in 1971?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the point. That's the point. I mean, it's this financialization. I mean, another, in the book, another favorite chart of mine, I'll just refer to it so people have the book, they can look at it, is, the wealth inequality chart, on page 20 of the book. The top 1% of the country holds 92% of the wealth. And that's not what it was.
Yeah.
I mean, to compare that, back in 1990, this doesn't even go back to 71. Back in 1990, they held a much smaller percentage. I don't know what the percentage is here, but as looking at the chart, you can see, I mean, as an example, mathematically, the numbers. Today, the top 1% of the country owns $45 trillion worth of wealth. Top 1%. Okay, go back to 1990, 30 years ago, the top 1% of the country owned $4 trillion of the wealth. So the wealthy have gotten 10x wealthier in that time frame. And the bottom line is how much the bottom 50% of the country owns, and it's flatlined.
Yeah. I mean, it's the 1971 where it shows both like high wage earners and the low wage earners and like middle class. You just like it's like kind of like going together. Like both are going up, like until this point, and sometimes it switches a little bit. It's like right there, and then like right around 1971, just goes like this.
The crocodile's mouth.
I mean, the crocodile's mouth.
Exactly.
Do you want to know what else has done a crocodile's mouth very recently? Gold in the long bond.
Yes. Well, there's another chart in here where, I won't be able
They used to trade lockstep, and they've just totally gone in different directions.
Correct. On real interest rates. I mean, here's another piece of, it's called evidence. It's in here, and I can't find it because I don't know what chapter it's in off the top of my head. But since 2020, when the last big print started, gold in bond terms, in 20-year T-bond terms, gold's up 200%. Bitcoin's up 2,000%. So the bond used to be the base layer of financial security. It was the risk-free asset. And here you are, you have these two forms of sound money that the performance since 2020, that's only 4 years, going on 5 years, have just crushed the risk-free asset. It's like, what's up with that? And what that tells me is we are in a sovereign debt crisis. I say this in the book. Part of the reason I wrote the book, I was watching this TV show in early last year when I started writing the book in May last year. And I was watching this TV show, and it was Red Blue, and my wife was watching it, and they were arguing like crazy over a bunch of stupid shit. I mean, just, woke. I mean, all the total crap shit. And I wanted to just scream. And I was like, how can these otherwise, high profile, intelligent people be, it's like they're arguing about the number of angels on the head of a pin when, there's just this obvious problem that nobody's discussing. I mean, we had a presidential debate last year, and neither candidate talked about the debt or, the deficit, which are, in my opinion, the two greatest threats to the health of this country. And they're just being ignored. And so, I was like, somebody's got to stand on a soapbox. Me, I'm a big mouth, right? And somebody's got to stand on a soapbox and scream, guys, pay attention. This is the problem's the money is the problem. And
they don't want you to know that.
Well, of course,
by design. I mean,
of course they don't.
Because then the whole system,
right?
I mean,
Well, because
what's the difference between inflation and hyperinflation is trust.
Exactly, and everybody who's in the system is benefiting from it, and that's why I won't get on CNBC, and the Wall Street Journal's not going to review it, and the those who have benefited from the system. It's Upton Sinclair, right? It's hard to get a man to understand that which contradicts what pays his salary,
of course,
and so they are not going to accept this, but. But there are 330 million of us, and there are only so many lawmakers and financial elites that have control of this system. And my prayer is that we can all understand it, and that once we do, we're going to see more, politicians like Ron Paul and RFK and Trump. I mean, you got to admit, Dominic, and I'm sure you maybe you had this reaction that I had. I mean, over a year and a half ago, would you have thought you'd see two major presidential candidates addressing a Bitcoin conference and talking like they're libertarian?
That was a special moment,
right?
A special experience being there.
Trump shows up and talks like a libertarian. Now, he's not perfect because
it was his first. He's just starting.
He's just kind of learning about it. But RFK's speech was killer.
Oh man, he crushed it.
I mean, he totally got it right. And so this is entering the conversation. Now, we don't have a consensus of the population saying, hey, the money's broken, we got to fix it, okay? And we got to get there before we can solve the problem. But how do we get there? We tell people about it. We show, we explain it to them in terms they can understand, so that the next time they have a political choice, they vote for a Lummis, or they vote for a Thomas Massey, or they vote for a Ron Paul equivalent, or they vote for because if we get that, we can fix it. I mean, it is fixable, right? It's not this isn't doom and gloom. It's like problem is here, solution is there, right?
Just an observation from the outside. We got a lot of inflation in the UK during COVID for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And everything went up in price, but it's sort of stabilized a little bit.
I agree.
But when I've come to America, my mum lives in California, so I come out here quite a bit. And like, when I was growing up, America was a cheap country. The pound was strong, and America was where you could go to America. Oh, great! We're going to go to the shops, and I'm going to get a pair of jeans, and I'm going to do all this and buy all this stuff.
They were cheaper. It was cheaper here.
It was much cheaper.
Yeah.
And America now, food is twice the price of the UK. Twice the price.
Is that right? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and I think for some reason,
I wonder why that is. Yeah,
because food in the UK is cheaper than it is on the continent, in continental Europe, just a little bit cheaper, but so that you notice, maybe 20 or 30%. I don't know why, because I think we import it mostly. Or maybe our regulation's cheaper or something. But when I come to America, like I never used to, I don't feel like a rich man when I just think, oh God, that's expensive. That's how have you heard me? I'm always talking about money. How expensive.
You are in Naples though.
Yeah, maybe, but it just so maybe. And when I turn on the TV, they talk about inflation much more than they do in the European media, in British media. So it's obviously much more present.
It is. It really is. And there's a part of the book where I talk about how they've cooked the statistics, and they say that inflation is only 2 or 3%. But ask anybody what happened to their auto insurance last year, or ask people what happened to their homeowners insurance as a result of the fires and the floods and all the other stuff. I mean, those are going up at huge rates. And just a perfect example of this, and I talked about it on another podcast recently. So the U.S. longshoremen, the guys who unload the stuff at the ports, right? So they went out and they've been underpaid. And I get it. I mean, these blue-collar workers, suddenly everything they're buying went up 40% in price. And they're like, what the hell? What happened here? My food's really expensive. These guys were able to get a 6-year, 60% deal. Increase, so that their wages are going to go up for the next 6 years. The U.S. longshoremen's wages are going to go up 10% a year. It's in the contract. It's written down. That's a long way from the 2% that the Fed says we've got for inflation, and that's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
So the inflation statistics, they're bogus. They're just,
of course,
they're just not real numbers.
Yeah.
The agricultural ETF DBA, it was up 27% last year. That's why your groceries are so expensive. Go look at cattle prices. Go look at wheat prices. They're not growing at 2%.
It's not like they printed $5 trillion out of thin air every
year. Yeah. It's kind of like, gee, I wonder how that happened.
So tell me about what's your position? And I'll be interested to see what you think about this as well, Matty. What about gold miners? What's going on with gold miners?
Oh man, God,
I think you're seeing the same thing with Bitcoin mining companies too. I think you're seeing
A little
this
bit.
kind of like lag.
Yeah, a little
The
bit.
same thing's happening in Bitcoin mining. So it's actually very similar.
Yeah, a
believe it
little
or not.
bit. So, well, that's a sore subject. As you probably know, I run a fund that is full of gold miners. It's got some Bitcoin too, but it's been very, very difficult, to be frank. And I think Bitcoin has stolen a little bit of the shine away from gold. There's a lot of alpha in Bitcoin, and people who used to chase alpha and sound money used to chase it through gold miners. I would say the biggest difference, though, and the reason why it's a problem is their costs have gone up. It used to be on average about $1,000 to pull an ounce of gold out of the ground. That's now $1,400 or $1,500. So they've suffered cost inflation on what they produce. And while the price of gold is up, it was $1,365 in the beginning of 2018. Now it's $2,900. It was stuck at 2070 for a long time. It broke out last March, went to 2,500 or so. But the cost, gold mining is a spread business, right? Whatever you sell the gold for minus your mining cost, that's your profit margin. So for gold miners stocks to do well, the price of gold needs to go up faster than the cost of mining the gold. And the cost of mining the gold is going up. And I think the miners on any metric are extraordinarily cheap. And I think the reason is, if you would go on Bloomberg anytime recently, and it's starting to change, and gold broke out from 2070, it went to 2,300. Every single estimate that was going back down to 1,900. So all the Wall Street and Bloomberg analysts were saying, well, this 23 is not going to last. We're going to revert to the mean. We're going to go back to 1,800 or 1,900. My view is we're going to 4,000. Okay. And now that's starting to become more clear as we bump against 2,900. So what I think is going to happen is when people wake up and say, oh, we're misreading, and because historically in the past, when gold bumped up, it would also come back down. It would breathe. It would go up, it would go down, it would go up, it would go down. And if the costs were going up, well, the margins aren't going to get any better. But now we're at 2,900. We're about to take out 3,000, and I think we're going to go from 3,000 to 3,500. And at some point, all those analysts are going to go, boy, we really got this wrong. We are in a serious gold bull market.
This bull market, if you look at the chart of gold since
it's incredible,
since
right?
2022.
Yeah.
There has not been a dip.
No, it's relentless.
Whoever's buying is not buying the dip. It's just like, it's not like vertical or anything. It's just relentlessly,
steady.
It's like, and it's a stealth bull market. Nobody's talking about it.
Exactly. I mean, gold is hitting all-time new highs, and central banks are buying. I mean, there are all these
retail isn't buying.
Well, yes and no. There were some great articles. Like Costco has. Did you see that? Costco sells gold bars, and whenever they'd get a batch in, they'd sell them out. So some part of America understands that gold is inflation protection and sound money, and they're buying bars at Costco. So, and I mean, the Chinese are buying.
Central banks are the biggest buyers.
Central banks are the biggest buyers. That's correct. So
there's a Bitcoin ATM at Costco now too. Apparently, that's what.
Is there really? Oh, that's fantastic.
That's on the street.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. The problem with those ATMs, I think the spreads are terrible.
The spreads are terrible, but for some people who want non KYC or just to dabble a little bit, get a little bit.
Get them started.
It's a tough business.
So the answer, Dominic, in my opinion, is as the analysts come to see that this gold price is not a fluke, and that in fact it's going higher, they're going to start to adjust it and go, oh my, these margins are getting better, and they're going to stay better. And therefore, I have companies in my portfolio that are trading at 3 times cash flow. Well, that's a long way from NVIDIA, which is trading at 60 times cash flow. Yeah. Right. And so they're gonna suddenly re-rate higher. And my fund is
they move quickly.
Exactly. In 2019, my fund was up 98%. In 2020, my fund was up 122%. Okay, those are great numbers. Frankly, since then I've been down. So it's feast and famine. But as these gold things re-rate, I think my fund is going to go up 100% a year again for a little bit.
Fascinating. Let me ask you a question about this, Larry.
Yeah. No. I was just going to go. So a lot of German retail, but German is a big retail market.
Yeah.
And a lot of German bought gold during COVID because they made a lot of money. So a lot of the German retail market net sellers,
really,
partly because they made a lot of money, and partly because the economy is so crap they need the money.
I see. Yeah.
And I think generally coin dealers are reporting lower trading volumes than is normal.
Interesting.
And I think retail who buy gold bullion also are the people who speculate in gold miners. It's a big retail market.
Yes, it is.
And if the retail's not buying gold bullion, they're certainly not buying gold miners. So something needs to happen to attract retail back into this market.
Well, and really what that is to have it start working again. I mean,
maybe it's higher prices. Yeah.
Yeah. And we've been punched in the face so many times. I mean, look, I believe in this stuff and I'm discouraged.
Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, but I also,
I'm like, one more bull market and I'm never touching a gold miner again. I've made that pledge in writing.
I have to say, honestly, I kind of get it. I mean, I kind of get it. Now, we just have to see, because, if we're really headed towards a gold reset and if we're headed towards gold 10,000, gold will kind of be like Bitcoin. You don't need to own a lot of it. I mean, I've got miners, the miners I've got should go up 10 or 20x. So, you don't, if you've got an asset that can go up 10 or 20x, if you only put 5% of your assets into that, that makes it really moves the needle, right? So to me, gold miners are speculative, but there's, the upside justifies the speculation with a modest piece of your capital. You wouldn't put all your money into gold mining because it's too tough a business.
Yeah. I was going to ask
some of those development plays.
Oh God!
I mean, they're so expensive to build, and you sit on them and you wait, and it's like everything in mining happens so slowly, and you're like, oh, when will this happen? But by the time the next bull market catches on, they'll just be going into production. And
I mean, stock picking is incredibly important. There are a lot of dishonest management teams. There are a lot of projects that will never get built. There are a lot of issues, et cetera, et cetera. But within all of that, if you do know what you're doing and you look at them carefully, and there's a sweet spot that I try and find, which is a company. I mean, so drill stories are exciting, but they're hit and miss. And if you hit, you can make 50 to 100 times your money, but most of them miss. Big producers are fine, but the Barracks and the Newmonts of the world, they have declining production profiles. They have a problem. They have a hard time finding as much gold as they're producing. So they're actually kind of shrinking businesses. The sweet spot in the gold mining business, in my view, is to find a company that has a mine operating and has positive cash flow, and it's actually profitable, so that they don't need to go to the market to raise money to dilute you. Okay. But then they're smart enough and they're using that capital to build mine number 2, or they have 2 mines and they're building mine number 3. So the way you make money in gold mining is 3 ways. One, production gets higher. If you were producing 100,000 ounces, you build a second mine, you're producing 200,000 ounces, your profits double. That's one way. The second way is you get your spread increases, the price of gold goes up. The third way you make money in gold mining is you buy at the bottom of the trough when they're trading at 3 times cash flow. And as we've all seen in gold bull markets, like at the top in 2011, they trade at 20 times cash flow. So you get multiple expansion. Wow. So, that's why there's power here if you get all 3 of those right, right? In other words, if you find a company that's going to grow their production, if you get it at the point in the cycle where the spread is getting larger, right? And at that point in time, everyone starts to come into the sector, so they pay more per dollar of cash flow, it works.
Sounds like you could take all that advice and apply it to Bitcoin miners as well.
Well, I was going to say, the parallels with Bitcoin mining, they're stunning. It's the same thing.
Very similar, yeah.
They've got their cost of electricity, it's going up, and they need, and the hash rate, makes it tougher and tougher to compete for and get those coins, right? So that's the difficulty, and a
little bit more predictability on the modeling of how much Bitcoin you're going to find. That was the one thing I was going to ask you about, is with gold mining, is like, it could be hit or miss, like the drill sites and all this stuff.
A little bit. I mean, if you've got a producer and you've got a 43101 deposit and you know it's there and you know what the grades are and you've had good geologists look at it, you can get reasonably comfortable. I mean, the biggest problem in these, as he alluded to, these development stories, is you can have cost overruns and time delays. Building a gold mine is not simple. And
same thing with a Bitcoin mine.
Yeah, it usually takes longer than you think and costs more than you think.
I think in my 25 years of investing in gold miners, I think I've known 2 that have come on time.
That's about right.
And on budget.
That's about right. Yeah.
So it's just like, what excuse am I going to hear this week?
Exactly. That's about right. Yeah, it's really brutal.
Yeah.
It's brutal. But, again, if you pay the right price, even considering that risk, you can still have a pretty good investment. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So back to the Bitcoin thing at Costco, Paul pulled it up. As of February 2025, so this month, Costco has partnered with LibertyX to install Bitcoin ATMs in all of its U.S. stores, providing customers with convenient access to purchasing Bitcoin. How about that?
That's fantastic.
How about them apples?
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, anything that increases the knowledge and exposure of Bitcoin is a net positive, in my view. And, we're doing it. I mean, the books are doing it. The podcasts are doing it. Word of mouth is doing it. I mean, I remember 5 years ago and everyone thought I was crazy and nobody had any interest in this stuff. Now, literally all my friends have called me, asked me, they're curious, they're trying to understand it. It's just a total change. And that reflects kind of the Malcolm Gladwell adoption curve. And I've got some charts in there on that. And how technology, S-curve of adoption.
Yeah.
It's like mobile phones. And just once it gets going, in 10 years, I think everybody will own some Bitcoin, or not everybody, but a large percentage of the population.
Guys, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I could sit here for another 5 hours and talk to both of you.
Yeah, me too.
Unfortunately, I got to go
coach talking to Dominic.
coach some sports, some kids' sports.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
But The Big Print, Daylight Robbery, 2 fantastic authors, 2 fantastic books. Thank you guys so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. And if you want to look me up, you should come and sign up for my Substack, which is called The Flying Frisbee, theflyingfrisbee.com. And yours, do you have a Substack?
I don't have a Substack, but I make a lot of noise on Twitter, and you can find me there easily. It's just Lawrence Lepard, at Lawrence Lepard. And so it's generally not very central bank friendly.
Thanks so much, boys.
Thank you.